Welcome back to the UiPath Introductory Training. In this tutorial, we'll go over the basics of automation and working with UiPath. Some elementary knowledge of programming concepts, including variables, if-else decision, and loops, would be helpful. But even if this is the first time you're hearing about these notions, you should be fine, as we'll try to explain everything as we go. When we first start UiPath, we will see this welcome screen, where we can start a new project or open a recent one. Let's create a new process and call it Intro. The interface is straightforward. Besides the conventional toolbar, there are three main areas that we will work with. On the left side, there is the Activities panel. Activities are actions that we use to automate what we do in different applications, like clicking and typing, and other data processing actions. Now, there are lots of activities in UiPath. To find the right one, we can type its name in here, but more about that later. The big area in the middle is the Workflow Designer, where our automation project can be built. Now, there are three ways in which we can add activities to our project: dragging them from the left pane, double-clicking them in the left pane to include them in the workflow after the current activity, or generating them automatically using the recorder. This on the right is the Properties pane, where we can see and change the parameters and settings of the selected activity. Each activity has a different set of properties, but we'll take a look at some of them later in the training. The projects created in UiPath Studio can be organized in two ways: as flowcharts or as sequences. The two structures enable us to control which action takes place and when that should happen. This is what a flowchart looks like. It works by executing each action from the start node down, following the arrows. Some special decision nodes can split the path to be taken into two possibilities, but only one of them is executed. Since they're easy to understand and follow, they're suitable for organizing complex workflows. You'll get to create a flowchart in a minute, but first, let us also see a sequence. As the name implies, it is a simple list of actions that we are telling UiPath to take one after the other. It's more appropriate for shorter, simpler workflows or pieces of automation that we can use in a larger project. Generally, when starting a new automation workflow, you'll first drag a flowchart to the Workflow Designer. One important aspect of flowcharts and sequences is that we can nest any number of flowcharts and sequences inside one another, and that helps us to sort projects out, review the high-level organization of the workflow, or execute the nested flowcharts separately to see how they are performed. For example, let's imagine a workflow that reads incoming emails and looks for attachments, which are then uploaded to a dedicated FTP server. Now, it's a fairly complex project, so we would break it into three distinct parts: a sequence to read the emails, a flowchart to find the emails that contain attachments, and one more sequence to upload the file to FTP. Of course, we might as well use three sequences, or three flowcharts, or any other combination between the two. Now, it's a very good idea to give your sequences and flowcharts with appropriate names. We'll call this one Get New Emails, this one Find Attachments, and this one Upload to FTP. To make this into a functional workflow, we need to determine the order in which the activities will be executed. So, we must connect the first sequence to the start node, as well as the rest of the actions. As you can see, it's already starting to make sense, and we'll make a loop to repeat the process. Now, we would normally open each container to start adding specific actions, or even other flowcharts and sequences, but that's beyond the scope of this introductory tutorial. Alright, now let's move on to variables. Even if you have no previous coding experience, you may already be familiar with variables, as they're used in mathematics to represent unknown fields or constants in an equation. For instance, in the equation y equals 5x plus a, each alphabetic letter is a variable that can have many different numeric values. When x changes, y changes too. As opposed to mathematical formulas, where those letters generally represent numbers, in UiPath and coding in general, we can use variables to store various types of data: numbers, text, images, files, colors, and many others. So, it's useful to think about variables as boxes that keep different types of data. The data in the box might change, but the box remains the same. In one box, we might hold an Excel table, and in another one, we might store a counter to keep track of how many times a user has clicked something, and in another box, a text message to send to the customers, and so forth. Here are the main types of variables, or boxes, available in UiPath, each for a specific type of data. Integer variables store whole numbers, such as 1, 2, 3, or 40 million, but they don't work with decimal numbers like 3.14. However, there is another kind of box for that. String variables can hold text of any kind, and we typically place it between quotation marks, and booleans can store a simple true or false value. Generic variables are special because they can store almost any type of data. Their purpose is to simplify variable creation and management by enabling us to skip defining their type. There are several methods that we can use to process the stored data. For example, split, replace, length, contains. We'll return to those methods in later trainings. And array is a list that includes any type of data as long as the items in it are of the same kind. Now that means arrays could contain integers, strings, booleans, and so on. Variables are easy to find in UiPath. They are at the bottom here, hidden by default. When this section is clicked, a list displaying the currently defined variables pops up. However, we haven't defined any variable in this workflow. To create a new variable, click here and type a name for it. We'll just call it my message to the world. Next, we have to set the variable type. Since we want it to hold some text, we'll just leave it as string. The next step is optional, but let's also give this new variable a value. Let's say, "What's up world?" in quotation marks. By the way, one very nice feature is the fact that if you rename a variable here in the variables pane, it will be renamed in all the instances where it's used. Now that's extremely useful when we build more complex workflows. The scope is another important property of variables, as it represents where that variable is available. For example, select the middle flowchart named Find Attachments, click Create Variable once again, and name this one Test. You'll notice that the scope of the second variable is now the Find Attachments flowchart. We could say that the test variable belongs to the Find Attachments workflow, and it will only be visible inside that box, not outside it. We can notice that by looking at the Variables pane and selecting first the Find Attachments flowchart and then the parent one. And that was all. Let's sum everything up. First, we had a quick look at the interface of UiPath Studio to see what we can do in each section. Then we examined flowcharts and sequences. And finally, we talked about variables. Thank you for watching.